Sally Svenson has been writing about aspects of Adirondack history since the early 2000s. She has covered topics that are quite dissimilar, including church architecture and even an obscure, more obscure Duchess of Marlborough, and we have examples of all of her books over on the counter. She also recently completed a manuscript on Adirondack theme parks and amusements, which is currently out for peer review, so we can look forward to that in the near future. Sally's latest book, Adirondack Photographers, which is this book right here, is the subject of today's talk. It was published, an Adirondack Photographers specifically from 1850 to 1950. Published by Syracuse University Press in 2023. It includes brief biographies of approximately 225 photographers who worked in the region. A number of them photographed Adirondack work sites and resort centers in parts of St. Lawrence County, and Sally will be focusing on some of those people today. There are copies of the book available for purchase after the talk. We have them on the counter over there. Sally is a New York City resident for much of the year and spends summers in her family's home in Upper Saranac Lake, which is where she is joining us from today. So please join me in welcoming Sally Svenson to the St. Lawrence County Center for History and Culture.
Good morning. As she's just said, I have been writing about the Adirondacks for over 20 years now, and I started with material that I found in this institution, so thank you. It's an article about in Adirondack life about an obscure Presbyterian minister who helped to lay out 14 churches kind of in a line here, and it led to my first book, which was Adirondack Churches. And what else do I say? Okay. Today's presentation comes from bits and pieces of material I found here as well. And I also found it in the course of working on my third Adirondack book, which is a biographical dictionary of some 225 photographers in the Adirondacks between 1850 and 1950. All but one of the photographs come from the collection of the Adirondack Museum, and which has got an excellent online collection of photographs of the region. And let's see. I also need to thank my daughter who did the PowerPoint program, which is well beyond my competence. Okay, there was one particular photograph that got me started on the idea of writing a book about photographers. And that was the last, in reference to the last book, which was on Blacks in the Adirondacks. And I was looking for illustrations and they were very hard to find. However, there was one very famous photo which appeared in every article and every book about the Adirondack Black community. It was a group of farmers in a field, was supposedly from just outside of Saranac Lake. It was taken by a well-known Saranac Lake photographer. But there was just something wrong about it. There were too many people in the picture, and somewhere in the background, I thought I could see mules, which are not a famous Adirondack work article. So I did a little research and I looked for this man whose name is Start. And yes, he was definitely the photographer of this photograph, but he spent 40 winters working for a hotel in Camden, South Carolina. And indeed, the Camden archives have a lot of photographs of African Americans in Camden. So I thought, well, it would be handy for people to know where people came from and maybe something about their dates, because if you're looking at a picture, that gives you a little bit more information. So that's how I started. And 225 photographers later, I think that I pretty much covered that field, although there are always people coming up that took 6 important photographs. I covered only mostly commercial photographers because that's what I was interested in. So from there, I will go on. And yeah, I did that very quickly. Okay. Okay, let's start off with this map. It shows most of the southern St. Lawrence County that we're going to be looking at today. Now, Mark Friedan, who is the fine historian, just told me that there are some places on this map that don't exist anymore. Cook Corners is what? Seavies? Is that Seavies? I'm sorry, what's Cook Corners now?
Well, the places that there's a kind of shirt loss, but Not really anymore, where it says Shirtliff on the map, that's actually Seabee's
That's
Corners.
Seabee's.
And, to the northwest of Cranberry Lake, Cook's
You said
Corners,
something else too.
that's the old name for that place, it's, known as Windfall. Now, Windfall used to be a place such that it had, a couple of taverns and a couple of hotels, and even had a post office. The post office was around for less than 10 years, and now it's really just kind of a suburb, if you will, Cranberry Lake. Everybody that lives in Windfall gets their mail at the Cranberry Lake post office.
So this is a current map online, which is only a little bit out of date, but as you can see, it pretty much follows the line that Route 3 follows today. And there are parts of the Adirondacks above that, like Colton, but they didn't really attract any commercial photographers, so they are not included here. So, rapid development of this previously isolated stretch of St. Lawrence County has everything to do with railroads, and you're going to see a surprising number of trains today. So, from the 1880s, both ends of this space were connected by rail, running north and south, and all tied into the New York Central Railroad at some point. So there's access points on both sides that you could reach into the middle here, and that's what happened. Sorry, I keep looking up and then losing my place. They moved people as well as industrial goods. So there was a tourist industry that developed along with a lot of lumbering and some mining and other things that took them into the wider world. So fast. And let's see. Okay, I will start with, now this is the first time I have used this. Excellent, okay. The first professional photographer to visit the area appears to have been Seneca Ray Stoddard, who is probably the most famous Adirondack early photographer. And he came out to photograph this early resort hotel, which was called the Childwold, in 1890, the year it opened on Lake Massawepie in the Piercefield hamlet of Childwold. He was the most successful photographer of the 19th century in this region. Based in Glens Falls on the other side of the Adirondacks, he started his professional life as a sign painter. He took thousands of photographs from the mid-1860s, many of them in and around Lake George, which was his favorite shooting place for commercial work. A descriptive guidebook to the Adirondacks he published in 1874 listed the availability of 600 stereo views, 108 by 10 photos, and 111 by 14-inch images. Do you all know what stereo views are? Okay, so I don't need to go into that. His photographic specialty was landscapes, particularly those of interest to tourists, because he wanted to sell these. His Adirondack picture-taking career ended around 1900. Childwold was named after its owner, real estate developer Addison Child, who bought the 15,000-acre parcel on which it stood in 1878. The resort did well, attracting visitors from New York City, Boston, and other distant points. Circa 1893, Stoddard returned again to take more pictures of the hotel, which, as you can see, had been greatly expanded since its earlier visit. And I will just go back briefly so you can see the change. And it grew quite speedily. So on one of these trips, he also photographed the much more modest Pondview House, some 3 miles away from the Childwold Hotel. I'm then going to show you a picture of the building to the left, which just shows you a little bit of close-up. So that was also a Stoddard photograph. In 1893, the New York World newspaper in New York listed a listing of hotels of interest to tourists. As it noted of the two hostelries, quote, Childwold Park House charges $17.50 to $28 per week. Pondview House, $10 per week. The discrepancy in pricing may serve as an indication of the relative accommodations to be had in this vicinity. If that makes sense. So, based on Stoddard's photographs, that appears to have been an accurate assessment. With the rise of automobile touring, standalone resort destinations in out-of-the-way places like Childwold Park Hotel, where guests spent an entire vacation, lost favor to options that included more travel. The hotel closed in 1909 and was sold and dismantled around 1917. So the Adirondacks' second most famous photographer during the same general time period was George W. Baldwin. Baldwin was born in Elizabethtown and maintained successive studios from 1871 in Port Henry, Keysville, Plattsburgh, and Saranac Lake, which was then just getting its start as a tuberculosis center. He then moved to Rutland, Vermont in 1904. He undertook a single commission in the winter of 1900-1901 in an area of the town of Piercefield known as Horseshoe. And I see that there is a book about the entire Horseshoe sugar maple syrup project there. This is one from the book. The Adirondack Experience has a picture book of, I think, 29 photographs. And the Library of Congress also has some, but unlike those at the Library of Congress, these were all hand colored. So black and white photography was the only photography available until the 1930s when color came into being. So there was mechanical ways of producing colored work. There was also hand painting, which was either done on the negative or on the individual. Here, this is very subtle, a lot of snow. These are both from Baldwin's book that he put together, probably for the owner of Horseshoe, who was someone famous. What's his name? I guess I get to that later. Abbott Augustus Lowe was the name of the wealthy entrepreneur. I think that his maple syrup farm was something like 32 miles square. And he invented a number of ways of improving upon storage, upon shipping. This guy is pouring his sap into some kind of tubing device that's bringing it into a central location. And also there's an article in the St. Lawrence County Historical Society, a 2023 issue all about this, if you want to see more on it. Okay. We move on now to the regional work of early 20th century photographers who chronicled the area during these decades. By far the most prolific of them was Henry Beach. Do any of you know of his work? Mark, of course, does. Okay. He was an important photographer who worked all over the Adirondacks and, like Stoddard, took thousands of photographs. In Beach's case, however, he used them primarily in connection with real photo postcards, which were photographs mounted on postcard stock, which you could then use the back on. And every town had postcards available, real photo postcards available of it. So unlike Stoddard, he was not interested in important tourist locations. He took them of primarily small towns, industrial facilities. Nothing, he never took a picture that I'm aware of Lake George, which was kind of everyone's favorite subject. And he was born in Watson, Lewis County in 1863. He lived in Remsen, Oneida County from 1906. And he liked small town sites, and that's what he had: logging operations, modest resorts. Thus, this stretch of the Adirondacks was a rich field for his photographic work. Most of Beach's photographs were taken between roughly 1906 and 1916. Most of them had this little tiny hand printing on the negative, which came up as the titles on finished work. This image is of Benson Mines near the village of Star Lake. Yes. Okay, I keep looking at Mark for confirmation. What's that?
I live about a mile from where I was taken.
Okay. Initial mining operations began in the 1880s, and the mine opened and closed many times before shutting down for good nearly 100 years later in 1978. Beach took fascinating images not only of industrial sites like this, but also of the villages built by regional industry owners to house the population that worked for them. This, for example, is a photo of the village of Piercefield, built in the 1890s around its hydropower dam and the International Paper Factory. Piercefield grew quickly and was a vibrant community until the paper mill closed in 1933. This beach photo is of another industrial village, Newton Falls, named for a Mr. Newton who centered on a paper mill he built at the other end of the region from Piercefield. Like Piercefield, Newton Falls had an array of cookie cutter housing for employees, some of it built in this case from Sears Roebuck kits. I love these little towns that have this row upon row of identical housing. So, in addition to the many straightforward photographs Beach reproduced on his postcard faces, he also invented a couple of wonderful stylistic novelties. One was the composite postcard, such as this one of Star Lake, dated 1910, which shows one or more images in general, along with fancy lettering and additional elements such as flowers. This one seems to have included a number of random fish. So. You can see from these hotels that the sort of middle-class hotel industry was also doing quite well at this time. These are all Starlight hotels that existed. The next one that's about 7 or 8 stories tall. So, another type of beach postcard featured photographic cutouts, creating imagined environments. This is one of them, an image of Piercefield, in which trolley cars, a crowd of people dressed in formal town attire, and the automobile have been superimposed on a simple postcard of the underlying village. He did lots of these, and often you'll see, in fact, the same car and the same people in several postcards. So he was very creative. Beach took a number of photographs in and around the village of Wanakena in the town of Fine. It was founded by 2 cousins with the last name Rich as the Rich Lumber Company. They're the ones who actually settled the town. Having harvested all the timber on lands the company had been working in Pennsylvania, they transferred operations north in 1902, buying a 16,000-acre parcel along the shore of Cranberry Lake, the 3rd largest lake in the Adirondacks, at the point where it meets the Oswegatchie River. The Riches constructed the village from scratch, even dismantling some buildings in their Pennsylvania operation, bringing them north by train on the Cranberry Lake Railroad they built into the village and reconstructing them. In Wanakena, the Rich Company undertook extensive logging operations and leased several mills to companies that used lumber parts. This beach image shows a Rich Company train dumping logs at its sawmill. The company plans for Wanakena included cultural and recreational facilities for residents, including a bowling alley, but it also envisioned a tourist presence with an eye to, of course, future land sales. It built an elegant hotel close to the railroad depot in 1903, just a year after the company arrived. The hotel was expanded in 1907. This photo obviously shows the expanded hotel. Having harvested most of the local lumber, the Rich Lumber Company moved on, this time to Manchester, Vermont in 1912. Before doing so, however, it gifted some 1,800 acres of land to the New York State College of Forestry for what became Wanakena's Forest Ranger School. This is an early composite image of the first buildings in the school. Beach located from Remsen to Fort Plain, Montgomery and County in 1916. He and his son opened an art shop and a portrait studio, and Beach largely gave up landscape work. He was known by the early 1920s primarily for his classified newspaper advertisements for his big bronze turkeys and turkey eggs. So.
Sam, can I add something?
Sure.
The Ranger School came into being because an employee of the Rich Lumber Company, when the Rich's lumber supply timber was played out, and they were picking up from Wanakena to move to Manchester, Vermont. One of their key employees was Otto Hamley, and he was the one who recommended that the Rich Lumber Company donate some of the cutover land to establish a training lab, if you will, for new forestry students, and that was how the Ranger School came into being. Otto Hanley was the first St. Lawrence County historian from Wanakena, the only county historian to ever come from Wanakena.
Yeah, if you see here, it says photos by H.M. Beach for A.M. Hamlin. So he was obviously helping this project along. So that's the end of Beach, and I'm always sorry to leave him because his photographs are such fun. Another train. Okay, wrong paragraph. There was also during its first years, a resident photographer taking pictures in the Wanakena community. His name was Harris L. Locke. He was born in Tioga County in 1878 and spent his early adult life in West Carthage as a mill worker. By 1903, however, he, quote, had employment in Wanakena. There he took up photography and, like Beach, published real photo postcards. This postcard view shows the arrival of a Cranberry Lake Railroad excursion train at the Wanakena Depot around 1905. I mean, to me, that's just amazing. This is a very sophisticated operation in the middle of essentially nothing. Okay, this Locke photo, most of which can be identified by this rather primitive printing that he did on machine printing that he did on the negatives. But this is the industrial side of Wanakena, and its images of the villages Ryan and Schleider Lathe and Pulp Mill. Locke moved on to Harrisville, Lewis County by 1907, where he opened a rhodomontary portrait studio and continued to take photos and publish real photo postcards of Wanakena. He found, though, that photography did not provide an adequate living for his family, and he moved on to Syracuse in 1910. He first found work as a chauffeur, but by the 1920s, he had his own trucking business. What was fascinating in writing about Adirondack photographers was what they came from and what they went to. It was often just a little tiny period in the middle before they went on to something else. An awful lot of them ended up as farmers in California, moving west with the rest of the world. Okay, one other Adirondack photographer spent a lot of real time in the region during the first decades of the 20th century. Albert W. Santway, born in the St. Lawrence County town of Russell in 1887. Right? Okay, let's see. Graduated from the Potsdam Normal School and went on to the University of Michigan with the intention of developing a career in chemical research. In 1910, however, at the end of his junior year of college, he contracted tuberculosis. Santway was forced to spend 9 months at the Adirondack College Sanitarium in Saranac Lake, where he learned photographic skills in its occupational recreational program. Upon leaving the sanitarium in 1911, he took up residence in Star Lake to continue his convalescence. Opening a photography studio, he also marketed landscape views, generally as real photo postcards, such as this one of the Oswegatchie River. I didn't recognize it offhand. He also took this view of a hotel in Benson Mines. Judging by the level of activity at the hotel, the photograph was probably taken around 1915, when the iron mine was working around the clock to meet wartime demand for iron or steel, whatever. Santway relocated by mid-1918 to Watertown, where he produced mechanically colorized postcards, most of them by other photographers, under a company that bore his name. You could tell periods in Santway's work by the printing. This is an early one because of the hand printed on the negative, and then he moved into typed print, etc. And he also ended up coloring some of his late ones by a colorizing process. So you can measure a rough date for his postcards by looking at the kind of printing that's used on them. Anyway, and he also, when he got to Watertown, he developed a company called Camargo Press, which is a publisher and distributor of advertising brochures promoting Northern New York's tourist industry. The Adirondack experience has several hundred photographs that are credited to him, but are probably were bought by him or loaned by him for the use of the work that went into these things. So one of my things at the Adirondack Museum is we have to sort out which are his photographs and which he just had some use of for a period, which hasn't happened yet. Okay. I have a little more on that. Okay, the press was liquidated not long after the outbreak of World War II because a lot of his photographers and the people who worked with him went off to war. Okay, I love this photograph of Piercefield, taken by Upper Lake photographer Frank J. McCormick. McCormick was born into a farming family in Jingleville, outside of Canton in 1872, and started his photographic career with a portrait studio in his Jingleville home. He moved on to Tupper Lake in the late 1890s and was listed in the 1900 census as a sawmill laborer. But by 1902, McCormick had established himself as a Tupper Lake portrait and landscape photographer and remained one for the next 40 years. So there are a lot of photographs around by McCormick. His proximity to Piercefield, which was little more than 2 or 3 miles away from Tupper, meant that he spent a good deal of time there. And he recorded a number of images during the town's heyday of the 1920s, when it was an industrial village tied to the International Paper Factory. I imagine that this McCormick photo showing a Piercefield parade is from the town's glory days. I would guess that the same about this one. It says, what does it say? Labor Day celebration in Piercefield. It's a photo of the town band, another local parade. Piercefield began to lose population by 1930 and was decimated by the departure of the International Paper Company in 1933. The 2020 census recorded Piercefield's overall population at 282. And it's pretty much just a suburb of Upper Lake these days. So we have 2 more photographers to talk about here, who made pre-1950 contributions to the photographic history of this region. The first of them was Herbert Houston, primarily a portrait photographer in Watertown between 1903 and 1942. Houston, however, undertook a commission to document in an album the work of the Emporium Forestry Company, an outgrowth of the Emporium Lumber Company of Pennsylvania. It was incorporated in New York in 1912, and the Adirondack operation, located in the Piercefield hamlet of Conifer, became the largest hardwood operation in the East, peaking at 125,000 acres and operating mills in the hamlet of Conifer and Cranberry Lake. This is an image of the company's mill buildings. More trains. The company's Grass River Railroad moved both product, including this load of bark, and people, and had nearly 100 miles of trackage at its peak in 1937. The company sold half of its land holdings during the Depression and the last major forest land parcel in 1945. The Adirondack Experience, which owns the Husted album and its 29 photographs, dates Husted's project from around 1930 to 1940. This photo, the next, were taken not by a commercial photographer, but by a 25 or 26-year-old student by the name of Philip Hastings, who has played a unique role in photographic history. Hastings was a talented amateur photographer, loved steam railroads, and developed a wide reputation as a train hobbyist, also known as a rail fan. A Vermont native born in 1925, he took a number of railroad-related photographs in the Adirondacks during the winters of 1949 and 1950, when he was a medical student at the University of Vermont, including this one of a train in the Conifer lumberyard. Hastings went on to become a psychiatrist in Iowa, but never gave up his love of trains. He continued to take train pictures, many of which featured prominently in railroading magazines from the 1950s on, and wrote several books on the history of individual railroads. After his death in 1987, his family donated his massive photo archive, including some 78,000 images, to the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento, California. I used a 1949 Hastings image of Conifer that I found in the Tupper Lake Library in my photographer's book, but because it was still in copyright, I had to get permission to publish it from the California Railroad Museum. Well, okay, the last landscape photographer included here, who fits inside my 1950 cutoff date, and whom I'm sure you all know well, is Canton's own Dwight Church, whose granddaughter is kind enough to be here today and who has spoken about him before this group also. Church was quite amazing. Let's see. He spent his entire photographic career, which spanned some 60 years in Canton. He began to take landscape pictures within easy reach of the town around 1910, and he vastly expanded his photographic territory, including into the Adirondacks, after getting his pilot's license in 1929. Church's primary vehicle for selling his images was as black and white real photo postcards. He took many photographs of the region that we've been looking at, primarily of buildings and ground level people-free landscapes, such as this one of the iconic footbridge in Wanakena. This has been set up by the lumber company cleverly so that people lived on one side of the river, and then they had to cross over the bridge to get to the mills where they worked. So it was a very distinct split in that particular community. Church was, of course, particularly known for his famous sky views, taken of large chunks of landscape from a hole cut into the floor of his personal airplane, a porthole next to his fuselage, or an open door. This is one of them, of the village of Cranberry Lake. By World War II, Church's real photo views were the most commonly found postcards on store racks throughout the Adirondack region. Church left behind more than 13,000 images. She's nodding. An admirable photographic record. He continued to take pictures up until 1970. This concludes the PowerPoint portion of this program and its emphasis on the varied landscape photographers who worked in the region. But I wanted to talk about two photographers who seem to have done photographic work, but were not based here because there were never, as far as I know, any photographic studios within this particular region. The first one was Nathan Stone of Potsdam, if you know that name, who on his own from 1872 and with his son from 1887 to 1897, when the partnership ended, ran two contiguous operations, the Great Northern Portrait House and the Great Northern Copying House, although a combined company name often appeared on the backs of Stone portrait photos. By 1894, his copying business was producing 15,000 copies of photographs annually for wholesale and retail customers across the United States. I'm in awe of his ability to fake images, as described in an 1880 newspaper article, noting orders fulfilled by the company, such as the isolating of a single girl's face from a group and fashioning from it a half-length portrait with arms and hands, the creation of a, quote, pleasing picture of a man erect in health, his eyes open and sparkling with vigorous life, close quote, from careful notes provided by the sender, along with the accompanying image of a dead body lying in a coffin. Yeah. Common requests included the addition of ear and finger rings and glossy silk for dresses, quote, with lace wherever it should properly appear, close quote, for women, and a, quote, enlarged or a better trimmed whisker or mustache, close quote, watch chain and or fine set of shirt studs for men. Doesn't that sound kind of AI-like? For its time, yes, no, 100 years earlier. The other portrait studio to which local residents seem to go with some enthusiasm appears to have been Runion's Brothers, which was a loosely organized Canton enterprise that offered portable, section-built branch photograph parlors across the 43 villages and hamlets in St. Lawrence, Jefferson, Franklin, and Lewis counties from the mid-1860s until 1923. Charles Runion's appears to have worked occasionally in the local region on his own and took over as well what were the remaining dozen branch parlors of Runion's Brothers still in existence after his brother's 1923 death. There's a good photo of the Runion's photo branch parlor in Tupper Lake, which burned in an 1899 Tupper Lake fire in my book. And Mark sent me last week a picture of the Runyon studio in, where was it? In
Star Lake.
In Star Lake. So they just kind of, they came and went, and obviously they shrunk over time. Close this. This particular Mr. Runion's committed suicide in 1923, apparently from overwork. And that's really what I have, and I would be happy to answer any questions, but And as I say, the book focuses on the entire region, but this is what I found relating to Keeper. So, any questions? That's gonna be easy.
I'm curious for you said that one of your earlier pictures of the factory, you said you lived here in the old factory she showed in the beginning?
I'm sorry.
You lived here, one of the photos she showed in the beginning was the old factory, you said it's near where you live.
I think it
What's
was,
it look like now?
There's nothing there now. Those buildings in the photo that Sally showed us were the original mine buildings. 1942, Jones and Laughlin Steel took over the mining operation as under a war contract, defense contract. And a lot of some buildings were taken down, a lot of new buildings were constructed, and J&L was there for, well, into the 70s. And when they ceased operations, they just moved out and all the buildings were sitting there and, you know, less than a mile away. Every day I drive by these abandoned buildings just deteriorating. Eventually, the town, working with the APA and several other agencies, got permission to have the area remediated. The buildings were torn down, and the debris carted away. And to remediate it, they actually had to dig down into the soil because of contaminants that had leached into the ground. So some of the soil was taken away as well. But that's like, it's right on Route 3, just east of Star Lake, at the Little River. But it was quite an operation. When J&L came in, they had to reroute the Little River. They asked their geologists if there was more to the mine, or was it just the bit that they were taking over. And the geologist said, no, there's quite a bit more ore, but the problem is it's underneath the village of Benson Mines. Well, being a company village, the company owned everything, the stores, the post office, the houses. So they moved several of the houses, a couple of the other structures. The original Benson Mines School was the company office for a few years. But once they moved all the buildings, then the post office ceased to exist. There was no more Benson Mines post office. Everything was demolished and the pit was expanded. And so there's really no trace of Benson Mines Village anymore.
for those who are familiar with that stretch of Route 3 and off to the sides, there's no industry there at all. And when you look at some of these pictures, you realize there were actually at one point hundreds of miles, probably 200 or 300 miles of railroad. Because every industry had its own rails so that they could carry things, and that's all gone. The only place that there's a bit of original material still there, I think, is Concord. They have, aren't there a few things there, but that's pretty much it. Actually, as we were driving out Route 56 today, there is a wonderful house just after you've turned off of Route 3 that is in the last stages of total collapse. I have never seen such a collapse. Take its picture on the way home. But it's amazing. It's a very large house. It's just falling apart. Yes.
Is it the one with the horse near it? There's a horse paddock. Whenever I drive to school, there's a horse paddock and there's a house that sounds like you described.
It's probably 3 stories high and it's just.
And it's like
that.
white.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I was looking just at that as I'm driving at the same time. I didn't see the horses. But yeah, so it's any other questions?
Were you surprised at how many photographers you found? I mean, I was. I
Yes.
had no idea that there were 225 and probably still counting.
Yeah, I mean, some of them were very short periods that they were working.
And they were all, and you would consider them all professional photographers, not just people snapping pictures for.
They were all people selling their work. But as I was saying to you before, the amazing thing about working on history in the Adirondacks is that there are a couple of wonderful newspaper sites where you can find almost anything. There's a New York historic newspaper site, and then there's another one that covers just a little bit outside the region. And I could find not only information on the photographers, but I could find exactly the days they were in town, because it's a little newspapers would say, it's October 6th and so came through today and took pictures of this and that. So I mean, that's how it kept growing.
I have a question.
Yes.
Excuse me. Were there any female photographers that you found?
Yes, but not here, not in this little region. There were several that, there were several that I came upon, and they're all listed in the book. One did a lot of newspaper, a lot of magazine work. There was a famous one in Adirondack Lake who took a lot of local pictures. And then I found one who, a lot of letters from her are in the Museum of Natural History in New York City. And she took commercial ventures on behalf of companies to take pictures of their operations, but nobody had ever heard of her, but she's now somewhat known. But no, there were maybe 5 or 6 women in this group of 225. No.
All right.
Women were more likely to be given the job of hand coloring photographs, and that was a very feminine career in that particular field.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Weren't some of the houses moved to either Minerva or Newcomb
From where?
from the Star Lake mines?
I don't know the history that well, but I know that a lot of the houses brought to Wanakena were brought up from Pennsylvania. And they just, so yes, if they could move their equipment and their buildings to another site as they moved on to denude some more forests of their trees, then they would certainly do so. It would save them a lot of money. Is that it? So now I guess tea and coffee.
So thank you so much, Sally.